Hello, and welcome to We Read Theory, a podcast where we read theory so you don't have to. My name is Mark.
My name is Alex.
And Alex, how you doing today?
I'm a little drunk, Mark. I'm not gonna lie. That's
fantastic
not
to hear.
Abnormal.
That's exactly how Martin Luther King would have wanted it, which is of incredible divine intelligence. Because this episode is, of course, in anticipation of upcoming Martin Luther King Day, and we figured we'd ring in the day of celebration with an episode on Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous letter from Birmingham jail. Have you heard of this before?
Yes, I have. I heard, legitimately, one of the only, cool things I learned in public school history class was, no, legitimately, you're biting your thumb right now, but, legitimately, he wrote it with a golf pencil on, the outside of newspaper.
Yeah.
Because they wouldn't allow him paper, which is fucking cool little factoid, bro.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting, he was also, he actually had, I know that the letter from the Birmingham jail was actually written in direct response to another piece called, I can't remember what it's called, but it's called A Call for Unity. Mm-hmm. And that was actually had to be smuggled in because he couldn't get newspaper. So that's a pretty cool little tidbit. Most people who are familiar with leftist thought have heard, or maybe not most people, but a lot of people have at least read a particular excerpt from this text, which is, of course, the part where Martin Luther King talks about his disappointment with the white moderate. And we will absolutely get there, but it's actually a much richer document than that. He talks a lot about how to organize a direct action campaign and stuff, which is really, really relevant to kind of understanding leftism as a whole. So I think this is a really great document to get into. Let's get started right now.
Yeah, tell me a little bit about it, my guy.
Okay, so maybe even more than some of the other stuff we've talked about so far, this is an extremely important document to understand in its direct historical context. When Dr. King wrote this letter, he was being held in Birmingham City Jail. He was in Birmingham, Alabama, as one of the leaders of a direct action campaign that included the kind of nonviolent demonstrations that the American Civil Rights Movement has become known for, like sit-ins and marches. The campaign began on April 6th, 1963. 4 days later, on the 10th, a circuit judge made a ruling that effectively disallowed the campaign completely. King and other campaign leaders publicly stated that they weren't going to obey the ruling, and on the 12th, 2 days after that, King, along with a number of other demonstrators, was arrested, and on that same day, 8 white clergymen from the state of Alabama signed a letter called A Call for Unity. The gist of the letter is basically, yes, we agree that racial injustice is a serious problem, but we don't agree with the methods being used by those demonstrating in Birmingham right now. The letter calls for efforts to be focused on the courts rather than ground action and urges Black Americans to just be more patient with their liberation. King is able to read this letter while in jail because one of his colleagues smuggles it in a newspaper, and the letter from Birmingham jail that we're about to discuss is a direct response to this letter, A Call to Unity. The letter from Birmingham jail itself is probably best known for King's expression of disappointment in white moderates, and we'll get to that, but its primary thrust is all about justifying direct action that involves law-breaking, both practically and morally. According to King, every nonviolent social movement consists of 4 stages. The first is that evidence is found of a social injustice, and it goes without saying that King and his contemporaries had plenty of evidence to go around. We're not going to discuss whether or not the civil rights movement was justified on this podcast. Anyone listening should be on board with that already.
I hope so.
Yeah. The second stage is negotiation. The oppressed class attempts to appeal directly to the ruling class for their rights. This is a necessary part of a nonviolent movement, but it's also basically destined to fail, either in part or in whole because the ruling class benefits from the oppression it allows. The negotiation stage ends when the oppressed class come to the realization that the ruling class must be made to grant their freedom. You can't just ask for it. For King, this came when the city fathers, high-ranking municipal officials and the like, refused to have productive negotiations, and when city merchants, who'd promised to take down discriminatory signage like, no black people allowed, no colored people allowed, they didn't really keep this promise. So that's the end of stage 2. Stage 3 is the stage of self-purification. Direct action is really hard. It doesn't just require effort. You have to do it right. Nonviolence requires demonstrators to accept violence upon themselves without returning it. Civil disobedience requires demonstrators to openly break the law with the expectation of receiving the corresponding punishment. Those who prepare to take direct action must be knowledgeable of what is expected of them and confident in their ability to meet those expectations. Stage 4 is direct action itself, the aforementioned marches and sit-ins. King discusses 2 points about timing your direct action. He talks about wanting to do it during Easter season so as to make the greatest economic disruption, because King understood very closely that you can't just show people that you're mad. You have to actually hit them where it hurts. So originally, the marches were planned for the Easter season, so they would disrupt the general, normal functioning economy as much as possible. However, this was eventually changed. They delayed the demonstrations until after a contentious election, which was coming up a little bit after Easter season. So you can kind of see already that there's a very balanced understanding of that, action must be made to be as effective as possible. So they originally wanted to do it during Easter season for the economic effects, but they decided to pull back because they knew that the demonstrations would rile resistance up against them, and they didn't want that to cost a contentious election. So I think that was pretty smart on their part.
Oh, no, of course. I think anyone listening to this podcast should be coming in with the idea of always understanding what a protest is for. Understanding that a protest isn't just distributing literature, posting signage. It's actually drawing attention to your cause by disrupting, the normal state of things.
Yeah.
That's going to affect you. It's not, I'm sorry, but it's going to affect you. For example, let's take, Black Lives Matter protesters after, I think it was the death of, I don't want to get this wrong, but at the same level as something like Eric Garner, if not him, were standing in the middle of a freeway blocking traffic to draw attention to their cause. This is a very
common thing that people talk about.
There is no way you would have heard of these kinds of protests if they hadn't done something like that.
You have to at the very least
totally
inconvenience
necessary.
people if you aren't causing an even bigger ruckus than that.
Exactly.
And people think of King as this paragon of nonviolence, which of course he was, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he wasn't willing to cause damage. Those are not the same thing. Engaging in violence and making certain people's lives temporarily worse are not necessarily the same thing. And he was very much in favor of making certain people's lives worse when it helped you fight for the freedom that you were fighting for. And that's something that I, of course, anyone who thinks that the American Revolution was a good thing, agrees with that.
Fundamentally, yes, but the people who bring up 1776 in arguments aren't necessarily thinking critically all the time.
Not always.
Of course. At the same time, also, side note, we're not endorsing or not endorsing any violent or nonviolent action as a podcast, but at the same time, I think Martin Luther King understood that, one, capitalism is violence, but inverted that to hit him where it hurts. Technically to the average person appearing nonviolent, but causing enough pain to the powers that be.
So that's actually a good point. That actually relates to another famous quote from this particular text, which is, of course, that a lot of people call themselves moderates, right? Because they prefer a peace that is the absence of tension to a peace that is the presence of justice, if you know what I mean. So people talk about white moderates, right? Talk about King and other, demonstrators at the time kind of bringing about racial tension. And he would say, well, yeah, sure. I mean, we're bringing about racial tension, but is that necessarily a bad thing if it brings us closer to a more just system? That tension is a necessary part of the process. And that kind of brings us to probably the most famous piece of this letter, which is, of course, King's disappointment with the white moderate. There are a couple of different critiques that are levied at King by the people that he calls white moderates. In particular, the group of 8 white clergymen from Alabama who wrote the call to unity. First, the demonstrations are bad because they cause violence. There wasn't an accusation that King himself was violent or even that his own demonstrators were violent, but the fact that violence would almost always follow in the wake of these large demonstrations, and that's a known quantity when you plan something like this, should dissuade you from doing it if you're an anti-violence person. And King basically says this is ridiculous, and I totally agree that it's ridiculous. He says that it's like punishing a robbed man for the fact that he owned possessions that made the robbery possible, and I think that that's pretty apt. I mean, you have people, fighting for equal rights, and the fact that you can't expect them to sit down just because, like, white supremacists will be violent to them as a result of them doing that. Obviously, that doesn't make any sense.
People are doing that even today. There's no. I'm
no.
like,
I'm not laughing at you. Of course, you're absolutely right.
Fucking okay. Specifically, you know who Andy Ngo is?
Of course.
Okay. So for those who don't know,
for those
right-wing
who don't know,
pseudo journalists, there's people out there who are unaware.
Just making a name pun. Don't worry.
Oh, fuck off. Anyway, will provoke people, namely leftist and quote-unquote Antifa protesters. I know that's sort of like, to them, it's basically a meme at this point. Anyone who reacts against right-wing violence is deemed a violent Antifa protester and looped into this category of people who are just violent thugs for no reason when they're actually just... and which Antifa wouldn't exist without fascists in the first place. So we're not getting into that. But
yeah, that's
the point is people are not even baited, but just like provoked and prodded into this shit, and then put on display saying, "Oh, these people are violent. These people are thugs."
Yeah, and that's
incorrectly.
That's kind of what That's kind of what King is talking about when he talks about the peace that is the absence of tension rather than the presence of justice. Is like that big difference. Is because when you have the absence of tension, it's not an absence of tension. It's an absence of the visibility of tension, but it's still there, bubbling under the surface. But if, say, the tension that you're talking about is the fact that people of color do not have full rights as citizens, then if you're a white person, then obviously that tension is going to appear as if it doesn't even exist. And that's really why King is specifically pointing at white moderates here and not just any kind of moderate, because I think that along with being a moderate, that being white kind of makes it easier to hold this viewpoint, because it's easy not to see the tension in society when it isn't on the surface. One of the other big criticisms that was levied at King and his associates in the call to unity was kind of this idea that civil rights have gradually progressed over recent times, and so people go, listen, things just get better with time, right? Why are you making a big stink? Things are just going to get better. Let it happen. Let the natural course of history run. And this is, of course, also ridiculous, because the reason why, in retrospect, it appears that we've progressed is not just because of some essential fact of time. It's because people like King worked. And I honestly find people making this exact same argument today about how, time is just kind of progressive and things just get better. And they point to the kind of progress made by people like Martin Luther King Jr., like Malcolm X, like the Black Panthers. And it's the disconnect just isn't even visible to them, and it's really shameful.
People, I feel like, especially, I'm not just gonna say like white people. I'm gonna say people of means, people of privilege. I feel like it'd be wrong to say
of just class privilege or of any kind of privilege.
Well, I feel like a lot of people could make this argument, but definitely of class privilege, sure. And more often than not, white people. It's presented to them in a very linear way. These are also the same people that believe the Thanksgiving story is that, colonists came over and planted corn and had a dinner with the Indians instead of infecting them with smallpox. They just believe this happens at a linear rate instead of a trigonometric wave of people being, pushed down to a point of great revolution over and over and
So
over
you're kind
again.
of coming at it from the Marxist perspective. Like you're getting into some historical dialectics here, right?
Okay, let's stay on topic here, Mark. Just a little bit.
Okay. Yeah. So that kind of covers the white moderate for the most part. And what you mentioned about the kind of story of the first Thanksgiving, the Native Americans, is really pertinent, because that same kind of like cleansing of history, that revisionism, that kind of redeems the ruling class of that era, is the same kind of revisionism that redeems the ruling class of King's era, where like the way that a lot of people I think about it is that like Martin Luther King and a bunch of other people like marched together and pleaded with like the white ruling class, and like a single tear like dripped down George Wallace's face, and he was like, segregation never again. Like, and obviously no one will like tell you that this is a belief, but it's like the way that they talk about it, it gives off this notion that is how they look at it. And of course that's totally ahistorical, and that's really why it feels so important to me to talk about this particular text. Besides the white moderate, there is of course also the white church, which was a very powerful institution in Alabama at the time. And Christianity textually is very egalitarian in certain ways.
We could do volumes on the hypocrisy of Christianity.
Obviously it's complicated, but there are points in history where Christianity has been kind of a force for equality, at least on the surface. And there's all this talk about like charity stuff. King thought that the church was going to be a great ally to the movement of equality. This was kind of before the era of the Christian conservative, the religious right. But of course he was deeply disappointed in how it actually went down. The church in Alabama, or in the country as a whole, never really made significant statements about the morality of desegregation or about its relevancy to church doctrine. And, this was deeply disheartening, but ultimately King soldiered on, and thank God for that. One last little piece, just to kind of tie everything together, is that King kind of comes to this moral conclusion in the letter from Birmingham jail, which is that you can't praise a group for nonviolence if its goals are immoral, and at the same time, you can't necessarily knock a group in the same way, at least, which maybe isn't totally nonviolent, if their goals are moral. And he compares his own group of activists to the police department of Birmingham at this time, who were, by King's admission, really disciplined and really as nonviolent as he thinks they possibly could have been in enforcing this disallowal of the protests. And the call for unity kind of pleads with King to recognize this, or at least on its own recognizes, hey, let's give it up for the police department that did such a good job in not roughing you guys up too hard, when they stopped you from protesting to end segregation. And King basically says, let's be gone with this way of thinking, that we need to, praise people who are working towards immoral ends, even if their means are nonviolent or moral in their own kind of way.
That's so great. I thought you were going to say, thank God they were, nice to us or something
No,
like that, trying to get me to endorse law enforcement.
No.
But King really said all cops are bastards.
He really did. He said all cops are bastards. He said there is no ethical consumption under capitalism. And he said, it's okay that historical revisionism is going to totally destroy most people's understanding of me, because one day a couple of kids are going to fix it for everyone and everything will be great.
You're not talking about us, right? And that about wraps it up for this episode of We Read Theory. Thank you all for listening. We're actually on Twitter now at We Read Theory Pod. Go give us a follow if you are so inclined. And if not, just keep listening because we appreciate, all your support and kind words. Well, that's mostly my mom listening to the first 5 seconds of it and saying, "I love you, honey." But,